Good afternoon. My name is Hung Tran, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center. And thank you very much for joining us toward the tail end of the IMF World Bank busy week of spring meetings and before the weekend. If there's one note of positive remark and self-congratulation that I pick up through the past few days of the meetings, it is that the fund has received the membership support for a quota increase of 50% to bring the resources of the IMF to almost $1 trillion permanent resources. And on top of that, the fund for the first time has been able to build up precautionary balances of 25 billion SDR, which will cushion the risk of the fund in lending to members in the future. However, if you listen more to officials from the developing community, developing countries, there's a note of concern and demand. They say, yes, welcome the increase in quota, but there's need to be a reform and realignment of quota so that the distribution of the quota and the voting share at the IMF will be more in line with the changing in the economic structure of the world, with developing countries now contributing a heavier share than before. So with me today to discuss these kind of issues, on the way from the nuts and bolts of reform and quota share, on the way to the broader geopolitical and economic backdrop for these demand to come forward, are two colleagues, Mark Sobel, right next to me. He has a very distinguished and long career at the U.S. Treasury in international finance and monetary affairs, ending up as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Finance, and then the Executive Director for the U.S. at the fund, and now Chairman of OMFIF, or Official Monetary Financial Institutions Forum for the U.S. And he and I have been collaborating on this kind of issue for a long time. Next to him on the other side is Ajay Tripur. He's now the distinguished visiting scholar at the Institute for International Economic Policy at GW University, but he has a very long and distinguished career as well. He's also my colleague at the Atlantic Council as non-senior resident fellow, and we both contributed to the Atlantic Council Bretton Woods version 2 reform series. But he was also the first Director General of the Indian Independent Evaluation Office, and then beyond that, a career with the UN, UNDP, and World Bank. And he can bring to the picture a very broad and diversified perspective to discuss reform. So let me start with Mark. We keep hearing about many developing countries, the latest being China, clamoring for change in governance of the Bretton Woods institution, particularly the IMF, change in the quota and the voting share. Can you give us a background of how this come about and what it's all about?
Well, thank you for having me today. I'll start off technical and not get philosophical on you. So basically, voting shares in the IMF have to add up to 100%. Yes. And if somebody goes up, somebody goes down. And countries really don't like to go down. Now, if you said to me, what should countries' voting share would be, we would probably both say, well, it should be a relative weight in the global economy. Now, how do you measure that, right? And you and I would probably say, well, GDP. But if you rely just on GDP, you're going to get some very concentrated outcomes. The US, China, and Europe basically would have the bulk of it. So one challenge that exists in the IMF is, and the World Bank as well, is how to balance, I would say, relative weight with, let's call it democracy, right? Now, I think the IMF has been successful because of its voted weighting structure. I wouldn't want to see the IMF go the way of the UNGA or the WTO. So, does China have a legitimate gripe? I think that's what you're partly asking me. So,
not only China, but yes, China.
I want to step back a moment. I want to go back about almost 20 years because this is something I worked on very heavily. So, between 2006 and 2008, there was a two-step quota realignment, and that was reinforced by the quota deal that was done in 2010, 2011 that we unfortunately couldn't get through the hill until the end of 2015. In that period, 10 percentage points of quota share were transferred to, let's say, dynamic emerging markets principally. The US, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration strongly supported that. We strongly supported including elements of PPP in the quota formula. We supported a tripling of basic votes for the low-income countries to boost their share. So I say that just because I'm proud of the work that we did back then. But it's my way of saying that sometimes people say the shares are way out of line. Now, China is 6% of the IMF, but it's pushing 20% of global GDP, depending upon how you measure it, et cetera. China is really underweight from any reasonable metric and the formulas that the fund uses, et cetera. If you look at the rest of the developing countries and emerging markets, I think India, Indonesia, Vietnam have a good case. But it isn't the case that one gets that the quotas are totally out of whack. It's basically China is super out of whack. A few of the others are underrepresented as well. Europe is vastly overrepresented. I can make further points, or I can stop there if you want to. If I've answered your question.
Let's get the discussion moving, and then I come back to you for final details. But just to finish off the set of numbers that you gave, so basically, yes, China is hugely underweighted. They have 6.38% of the share, but the economy measured by the way that the formula measures 60% in market prices, 40% purchasing power parity measure, they have about 17%. So by the agreed way of measuring GDP, 17, they have only 6.4%. So they have a justified and legitimate complaint that they are heavily undervalued. However, the US is also undervalued or underrepresented. Because if you look at GDP, again, the way the formula calculates it, the US now has 21%. But the voting share of the US is only 17%. Of course, more than enough to have a voting bloc in the major decision voting, but way underrepresented relative to the GDP share. Europe is way, way, way overrepresented. The EU, 25% voting share, but only 17% in GDP. But other developing countries, let's take the case of Africa, very interesting and very difficult to address. They have 18% of the population of the world. They have 6.5% of the voting share in the IMF, and yet they contributed only 2.7% to the global economy. So you have these two, 18% of the population, only 2.7% of the GDP, but so they are somewhere in between. But it cannot be said that they are underrepresented. They are overrepresented relative to their contribution to the global economy now. And that makes the reform very difficult to navigate. But
can I just say that was a conscious decision, and that was due to our support for tripling basic votes back in 2008.
Absolutely. But the point that you and I try to get across is that yes, the case of China is clear, but if you increase the share of China up all the way to their share of GDP, that means everybody else have to give up their share. Starting with the US already underrepresented, but Europe will really have to give up a lot of their share at the moment. But AJ, I bring you in here to see from your wider experience and perspective, particularly with the developing countries, how do you see these demand play out?
Thank you, Hung. Yeah, I think Mark laid out the numbers on the voting share very well, and you've summarized it. But I think there are two other bigger also points that cause huge resentment. One is the arbitrary size of programs. There are countries that get 30 times their quota. And then there are, and countries with influence seem to get bigger support from, especially if you look at IMF programs. And then, of course, the World Bank and the rest of the multilateral banks then support those in even bigger volumes. And then there are others who don't have that kind of support, who end up with having to have huge austerity as part of the program because they are not able to get the same volume of resources. So that's another big resentment. And I think the Asian financial crisis was also a very sore point, because when Asia went into a financial crisis and the Asian programs were very pro-cyclical, if you like. I mean, the austerity that was imposed actually, in the view of many developing country experts, magnified the size of the crisis. Whereas when the global financial crisis took place and when the problem hit home in the developed world, the programs that were followed were obviously very counter-cyclical, as they should be. So I think those two are also being observed by people in the developing world as, well, you know, what's good for us is not good for the poorer countries. So there's a much broader resentment, especially among the developing world, who are not so much focused on the quota issues, but on the nature of advice, the nature of programs that are being imposed on them. They're also watching in terms of now the emerging debt problems, that, you know, growing debt problems in these countries, and how little is being done, and much of it is being done in a very slow case-by-case process. Now here, of course, the politics with China comes in also, because China is a major creditor. But let me stop here and say that I think there's a broader set of resentments than just the issue of the quotas, which is perhaps, as you have rightly said, more of a China versus Europe issue in terms of the size of the quotas.
No, I'm glad that you raised this issue, because when you talk about governance, there are more than just quota.
Yes.
And you can have reform of quota and voting rights.
Yes.
But then there are things that you could do to reform, to change the way the fund operates.
Yes.
Without the need to change the quota.
Yes.
But let's move into that later, because I just want to finish the quota first and then. But a very important issue that you raised. About the size and the allocation of lending resources to different regions and different countries, the conditionality attached to the lending, and now what to do with the debt crisis in many countries. So let's move there. But let's finish the first part. Mark, what do you see between now and June 2025? What is the target date for the fund, or for the board setting out for the fund to come up with an alternative measure? That means a new formula to suggest how to distribute the share and how to recommend the board going about it. So what do you see happening between now and June next year? Is there a realistic chance of any new quota formula to be agreed and new quota realignment to be agreed, given the geopolitical tension?
Wow. How do you expect me to know that? There's going to be a little event in November that might also have some implications on this matter. So what I would say is, I mean, technically speaking, the fund doesn't need a quota formula, and the G7 communique I just saw, if I read it correctly between the lines, almost hinted at that. But the quota formula will cause huge fights, because, as I said, voting power equals 100%, and somebody has to lose and somebody has to win. And so the U.S. says, well, and China also. China and the U.S., when I was in the board, agreed on quota formula type issues. There's more GDP. The openness variable, which others rely upon to boost their share, I think is very badly constructed For example, if Belgium trades with Netherlands, it boosts both of their quota shares, but they're part of a currency union. And that, I think that should be taken out. And then you have cases like entrepot economies, and it balloons theirs, and you get some very perverse results. But those countries are going to want to rely upon that to boost their shares. And then there's this compression variable, which is very opaque. But the reason it was put there was to take calculated quota share from the U.S. and China and redistribute it to others. So the formula, it's a gerrymandered mess. Now, to answer your question, what I think is the heart of your question is there's tension between the U.S. and China. We know that. We know what the politics in this city are with respect to China. I think China deserves more share. I would love the managing director of the fund to say, China, let's really make a big push on delivering on debt, on transparency. Let's take the concerns that exist in Europe and the U.S. about overcapacity far more into account. And if you can deliver on that, we can push you up in the IMF. It's not going to be to whatever 18 or whatever, but make them the number 2 member of the fund, which they rightly deserve to be. That's what I believe will happen. Do I believe that the politics of this city will support that? No. The Democrats and the Republicans are kind of aligned on China. So I think it would be maybe if there were a honeymoon period, maybe a new administration could push very quickly, but there will be major squawking if the U.S. were to allow China to go up. Unfair, and whichever party is out of power would savage the administration for doing that. I think it's a hugely difficult lift. Let's see what happens in November, and then I could give you a clearer answer. But I think it's a real heavy lift. But what that means is the perception of the fund as illegitimate and out of balance will increase.
Let's finish off by remarking on this, and I will invite your observation as well. And that is 2 issues. Why do we need the quota formula? It is a mess, yes, but I think we need it. But I explain later. And then the grand bargain. If China were to do ABC, the fund and maybe other countries will support increasing their quota share or voting share. Okay. Now the formula. I agree, because I have many things there that I'm very unhappy to see. To start with, by the use of PPP, purchasing power parity, to measure GDP and compare different countries. I think it is totally misleading, because the whole PPP methodology is designed to measure the standard of living and the purchasing power of people in their home country, doing a lot of non-tradable goods and services to see how well they live. It is not designed to compare or to measure the economic power, economic weight, economic influence of a country vis-a-vis other countries. Because when you deal with other countries, you transact based on market rates. You don't transact based on PPP rates. So I think the whole PPP is already the wrong way to start. And then the openness variable that Mark mentioned may be suitable 40 years ago when trade dominates the capital flow. Now trade is only a tiny portion. Capital flow, financial transaction, asset flow across borders is many times larger than trade flows. And therefore, you stick to measuring trade flow, US has a very low weight. If you open it up and measuring the whole financial asset, then the picture is different. So but at the end of the day, you need something to hang your hats on. Because if you don't have a formula that everyone agree, the methodology, then how do you decide you get X% and the other guy get 20%? It's purely arbitrary.
May I add one? I'm in total agreement with you, but the way I see it is that the big dog fight between China and the United States. I'm no expert on China, but let me say the way is at the WTO.
Yeah.
It's not at the IMF or at the World Bank. At the IMF and the World Bank, in fact, there should be greater cooperation because the issues that they're going to deal with on climate change, on debt, development, on African progress.
Yeah.
These are issues where interests of China, United States, and even I would say Europe come together, right? So there, I think the WTO is another issue, but which we can talk about if you like. But at the fund and the bank, I see greater cooperation between these countries on the sets of issues that they collectively must deal with.
Right.
And therefore here, a bargain, maybe not a grand bargain, but at least a sort of partial bargain is possible. That's how I see it. And also I watched the statements of Ajay Banga, the new World Bank president, when he was asked about this issue of China versus the West. He said, that's not my problem. We are going to work with China and, of course, the United States and the West. The problems we are dealing with of poverty and climate change are insoluble unless we all work together, right? So I think that's the way I see it.
No, I'm very glad you bring out the differentiation between the two institutions here, World Bank and IMF, where I agree with you that there are more issues and circumstances where the interests of everybody, China, US, can be aligned.
Yes.
Whereas in WTO is truly, you win, I lose. It's not win-win,
Exactly.
In a way. Now, the question is back again to both of you. Mark, I agree with you that the politics in this city make your bargain difficult to see how it can be done. But how about the politics in China? Will China be amenable to this kind of idea that they change their behavior in exchange for more influence at the IMF?
That's another interesting question. I want to pick up on one theme that both of you have outlined. In my experience, the Chinese are very strong partners of the IMF. The People's Bank does a good job, good relations. They work well. China's a major creditor to the IMF. And to pick up on your point, I think you're absolutely right. China and the US both have a shared interest in global economic and financial stability, which is what this place is about. I do think the Chinese want more share.
Yeah.
Would they have an overt grand bargain? I doubt it. Are there quiet discussions that could go on that could influence behavior behind the scenes? Maybe. But what's the joke about Zhou Enlai and what do you think of the French Revolution? Right. And it's too soon.
Too soon.
So we will see.
Let's go to the issue that Ajay brought up a short while ago, size and volume of funding going to different regions. Is there bias in there? Is there arbitrariness in that kind of decision? I'll just give you a figure. Lending of the fund to Argentina alone is bigger than lending of the IMF to Africa altogether. So is that unfair, Mark?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So I have one comment on your thesis, and maybe I'm being naive. It seems to me that when countries get into trouble, big trouble, they have a financial crisis, they're going to have to tighten their belt. There's going to have to be austerity. They're living beyond their means. And so now how you deal with the financial crisis versus a country that's somewhat endemically in that situation, such as a Pakistan or an Egypt, I think those are different cases. I think in the Asia crisis, we were dealing with financial crises, and I think that's very different than what we're seeing with Pakistan and Egypt that are perpetually facing troubles. Picking up on your point about the lending to Argentina versus Africa. So let me just put Argentina to the side for a second and just say, low-income countries in this building are financed through the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. And that is not, they do not use IMF quota resources, the $1 trillion of lending capacity. This is financed by loans by governments and subsidy resources to bring that down to, the loan rate down to zero for the countries. And so that's a very circumscribed pot of money. Now, you could say, well, it should be bigger. I agree. I've advocated for gold sales to bolster the self-sustained capacity of the PRGT, but I think you have to keep the quota resources somewhat separate from the PRGT. Now, was lending $44 billion to Argentina wise? In hindsight, it's easy to say yes. It was harder at the moment it happened to make that case, but I think that. And then you talked about counter-cyclical, pro-cyclical. You know, when I
conditionality.
Well, this is the financing, conditionality. So basically, you know, when I think about Greece, nobody's going to think about that as counter-cyclical, right? And again, I think the Asian countries, they hit the wall. They were going to need to tighten macro belts. We want to talk about fiscal monetary balance and all that. That's very difficult terrain. But I think the case same in Europe happened. So I understand your argument. I'm not as fully persuaded that that when countries need to do some belt tightening, that there is so much of discrimination against one set of countries as opposed to others.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to get back to you on the point that yes, there's a differentiation between a normal emerging market countries like Argentina making use of their quota-based resources, and if they get into exceptional program, they can have several times more than their quota, and therefore the size is bigger. For low-income countries, their quota is tiny to begin with, so if they have many times their quota, it's still small. And if they can draw only on the concessional facility, it's restricted. But that is the core of the problem, in the sense that the countries, the members that need financing the most, timely in sufficient amount, are those that really cannot use the quota-based approach that the fund is organized. We open only to the concessionary facilities which are restricted, and therefore there's a mismatch between needs and what is available. Whereas normal emerging market countries can say, okay, we can say with the quota-based system. So how are we going to address that? Can we change and somehow de-link the financing need from the quota?
But also, just to add that, you know, since we did this work for the Atlantic Council, Bretton Woods too.
Yeah.
So, you know, so these are not my views. I'm giving you what's the literature out there and what are they saying. And some of this literature is from within the fund itself, from the fund's own research department, showing huge variation, particularly Argentina is one case, but massive support for particularly countries in southern Europe that got into problems, right? Now, even after 32 times the quota that was given to Greece, they still had to have austerity, of course, but the effort was to maximize as much as possible that was being provided to Greece. In contrast, I mean, you look at what Sri Lanka got recently, or some of the other African countries got. It's not even 3-4 times their quota. I worked a lot on Turkey when I was at the World Bank. I was the director for Turkey when they had that big crisis. So I worked very closely with the fund on that program. There, with all the support that Kemal Dervish could generate, I don't think he ended up with even 10 times the quota, probably 6 or 7 times the quota. And that was considered pretty generous in those days. So there is something there worth looking at, is what I'm trying to say. The other thing is that is that on the contracyclicality, there's a vast literature, and the reason for very heavy reserve buildup now in countries is because they don't want to go to the IMF ever again, right? Which is a good thing, but the cost of that is that if you look at, and this is some of these issues we mention in this paper, which I can share with you subsequently, Mark. But there again, the perception is we need to have as much precautionary reserves as possible, because the last thing I want to do is go back to the persists because of the nature of the programs that were imposed in those days.
Yeah.
So that's the perception, is all I'm sharing. I may personally agree or disagree with some of these issues, but I'm just saying that that's what's out there.
But it's interesting the way our discussion evolved. We started up with quota, and we get to the point where I want to ask you the question, does it make sense going forward to rethink the quota-based approach, to link a little bit the quota with access to fund, and even in distributing SDR, if we have a new distribution, would the distribution will be proportionate to quota? Because then it will end up giving more money to people who have already a lot of money. I mean, there's a logic of the quota system, but it has its shortcomings, no?
But I do agree with Mark that, having worked at the UN, that's not a model that one would want. Because when you're dealing with finance and financial institutions, the who pays should
now, when you work with finance, the golden rule applies.
Yes.
And golden rule means who has the golden rule.
Yes.
Mark?
Well, I want to come back on the low-income countries. And, one thing I would say is that stabilization is a necessary condition for growth and poverty reduction, but it is not a sufficient condition. So, I think the IMF has an absolutely critical, important role to play in LICs. I think the institution across the street has a much bigger role to play. And so how I think about the amount of financing that goes to them is relevant to that. Now, again, more might be very helpful, but it's the question really for the shareholders. They're just not putting up the money for the PRGT. Hopefully that will change, but we will have to see. One comment, whenever I used to think about this at the Treasury access, I would look at it. We had this chart, and we look at access relative to pre-crisis GDP. And most of it, the big cases tended to be 10 to 15% of GDP, which was a big number. SDRs, well, to me, the SDR is a reserve asset. That's what it says in the IMF articles. I'm fine with rechanneling since there was an allocation. But, in the 60s there were these debates about should the SDR be an aid instrument or a reserve asset. And the answer then was a reserve asset. It seems to me that rechanneling has reopened the question a bit. So I have a lot of questions about what is the role of the SDR in the international monetary system.
Yes, and I think that is something that going forward, it really should be explained more to public policymakers to understand the nature of SDR and what its limitation is. I mean, you cannot just issue SDR and use it to finance climate change activities, because it's just not, I don't think it's even feasible. But anyway, let's move on and look at another set of questions that Ajay raised, conditionality. And that is really one of the main complaints of many debtor countries, developing countries. We are in crisis, the fund come in and the fund say, tighten your belt. And basically it hurts the chance of recovery of the country, at least in the eyes of the authorities. And as usual, it hurts the people least afford to be hurt, the people already poor, because the way things are structured, that's how it works. So basically, the complaint is the medicine is sometimes worse than the disease. However, from the point of view of the fund, and here I have to quote our former colleague, Ken Rogoff, he had a good, very strong debate when we were there 10 years ago. Again, the complaint is IMF come in, impose conditionality, make matters worse, and the country end up worse off than before. But Ken Rogoff say, look, your house is on fire, you are in crisis because you have poor policies, you overspend, you consume more than you raise taxes for, and your house is on fire. You call the firemen in to put out the fire. But somebody say, oh, whenever there's firemen come in, there's fire. So you cannot jump and say, look, firemen cause fire. It's the other way around. So that's how, in my mind, conditionality can be perceived completely differently from different point of view.
No, but I mean, I accept the need for austerity. There's no issue that the reason you got into a problem was because you overborrowed earlier and overspent. The problem is, how do you distribute the pain, right? So program after program, you see that the bankers and the financiers, they get a very small haircut. The poor get sucked in many countries because a lot of their subsidy programs get cut at a time when they are already in a crisis where there are no jobs, and So anyway, I'm just giving you a sense of that's the literature out there. Yes. That these programs, their first priority is to bail out the external financiers, private commercial financiers who come in. The size of the haircuts that are imposed on them is very small. This is the debate, right? And so it's not a question of austerity, it's a question of who takes the cuts. That's where the issue is in the literature.
Great. You and I are converging.
That's good.
So I've used your fire truck analogy, or I used an emergency room doctor analogy before, so I accept that. I think you agree. Now, is the emergency room doctor perfect? No, they make mistakes.
Right.
Okay. So 2 points I wanted to make on your comments. I think, and I know when I was here and overseeing IMF issues at Treasury, we always strongly advocated for the fund to do a better job on pro-poor policies and to be far more supportive of social safety nets and preserving them in the programs. I think that the Fiscal Affairs Department pushed that point. Sanjeev Gupta did a good job over the years. So I think the fund has made major progress on that front now when you compared with a few decades ago. I think that's good. Mm-hmm. Also, subsidies, if you eliminate subsidies or reduce them, target the poor, give them some support. And then I really agree with you on debt relief. When we did MIDRI, Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, we eliminated the debts to low-income countries, in essence, in the mid-2000s. Now, you see, if I take Sri Lanka as a case, it's not a common framework case, but it's a lower income case. If I look at the fund document, and I hope I'm getting this right. If I'm wrong and I offend anybody, I apologize in advance. But if I looked at one of the restructuring scenarios in the fund document, and it basically said in 2027, 2028, Sri Lanka's GDP, a debt to GDP ratio with a restructuring would be 105% of GDP, and that half of its revenues would go to service interest. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking to myself, well, how is this sustainable? This is like a recipe for evergreening. It is not a recipe for getting rid of the debt overhang and helping them out. So I think there needs to be a lot more focus on the debt sustainability analysis and to adopt tougher measures. But of course, as you say, you have the private sectors and you have official creditors who want to get repaid, China among them, and that creates a dynamic that doesn't necessarily support getting rid of debt overhangs.
Right. And we discussed this issue back and forth over the years, but I just want to bring in the perspective that at the end of the day, when a country is in a debt crisis, it has lost access to international capital markets. It cannot get money to fund itself. And sometimes it cannot even get money to fund emergency day-to-day operation. It's really in dire need of liquidity. So the issue there is how to restore access. And you cannot restore access. At the end of the day, the private sector has to come up and pay everyone. The private sector putting in new money. With the new money, the country repay the fund. The country repay other official lenders. The country rebuild its fiscal capacity all because of access to international capital markets from private sector. Now, if you want that to be restored, you have to do things in the way that you give private sector owners of money or manager of money the confidence, the comfortability that they can bring the money in. If you do it in a way that you hack it down to 10% or 5%, which theoretically you want to do, then you make sure that they never come back. So I think that is something that you will have to try to balance to get things going.
Can I push back on you?
Oh, yeah.
Sure, of
Me
course.
too.
You first.
No, after you.
I've always heard that argument, but there was an Argentine debt restructuring in 2016. Argentina, the world's biggest serial defaulter. And what happened? In 2017, the Argentines floated 100-year bonds, a century bond, and the private market gobbled it up. So in my view, the private sector has a self-interest in getting as much repayment as possible, and along with the credit rating agencies, they're going to say, oh, you'll lose access forever and ever. But I think the reality shows that the private sector has short memories, and I think the Argentine 100-year century bond is the best example of that.
I think I just want to say I fully agree with you.
It's 2-1 here.
On this one, I fully agree.
Right. Let's say that I don't fully disagree with that, but I just want to point out that the 100-year bond was issued after the sheet has been cleaned. So you have done a restructuring, you have debt under control, sustainable going forward. So the credit outlook for Argentina at that point in time was much better than ever before. Okay, number one. Number two, under the government at that point in time, pro-reform and promised to do the kind of things that the funds always wanted Argentina to do. So if you compare the two, that is the background of why the century bond was accepted.
Yep.
I don't say that right or wrong.
And there was another restructuring in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But when you are back in 2015, you cannot foresee what happened
Absolutely.
in 2020.
Yeah.
But
hindsight
can I just, to add to Mark, can I say one more thing on this, which is that, the thing is that if you keep bailing them out,
right,
then they don't do their diligence
right.
on, who in his right mind would be lending that much money to, I don't know, I won't want to name particular countries, but right. Knowing full well, the kind of regimes that will be using that money. Right. So, but if you keep bailing them out, it's a one-way bet. So that's the other issue, the moral hazard that you have created also, right?
Yes, again, it is a complicated story, but let me point out another fact. That is, everyone realized that to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, to meet the need for climate mitigation and climate transition, you need trillion and trillion of dollars, which governments don't have, which the World Bank, the MDB don't have, which has to come from private sector. And so there's a thing of the thought across the street that the World Bank will put in some capital commitment with which to catalyze 3 times, 5 times, 10 times private sector money coming in. But the reality is, looking back in the past several years, all the MDB together, for every $100 they put in, they catalyze $15 of private sector money. So the multiplier is 0.15, not multiple times. Yeah. So back to this issue of how to have this balance where you can attract and crowd in private sector.
You know, I did the first guarantee at the World Bank.
Yeah.
That was after an earthquake in Turkey. We put together an insurance scheme. It was reinsured for $100 million backstop guarantee. $2 billion of reinsurance came in from Swiss Re and Munich Re. So I know this business quite well, but it has been very difficult because of the internal policies of the World Bank. They docked Turkey the full 100 million of the guarantee. When I argued with them that the probability of this being called is maybe 5%, it didn't matter to them. Number two, the fees that they were charging for that guarantee were very high. So I think some of the internal, and I'm very confident that Ajay Banga will fix all this, because he knows exactly that it is some of their internal policies that have made it very difficult for them to be amplifying external resources as well.
So on that hopeful and positive note, and also we have run out of time, thank you very much for tuning in and listening to our discussion. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as we do here at the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was lovely to meet you, Mark. Yeah.
I'm glad we could agree.